So what I would like to present is some insights, ideas, how Girard or how mimetic theory helps us to understand our world. And of course, I do not know you, so in some way I respond to questions that I have. And hopefully some of those questions also chime in with your questions and views. But I'm happy afterwards in our discussion to talk about all the things you are really concerned about. So my program looks like that. I would like to address some issues in 4 steps. I will start with sibling rivalry as a main cause of human violence. I will then address the contagious nature of violence. I will talk about overcoming the scapegoat mechanism by siding with the victim. And the 4th point is, I think we have to distinguish between the sacred and the holy. The last thing is one of my issues that I pushed forward the last 2 or 3 years, and it's very close to what I think has to be done. So let's start with the first step, and some of the things are you are familiar with, of course, and I was asked not to go into basics, but I think if we discuss mimetic theory, we have always go back to the basics, and it seems to be a very simple idea, but then if you go deeper, you see this simple idea can become quite complex in its consequences. So when I'm talking about sibling rivalry as the main cause of human violence, I am actually addressing something that is very often hidden, because very often violence is attributed to difference, distinctions, other cultures, clash of civilization, and that is in some way easier than to talk about sibling rivalry. So the starting point of mimetic theory is mimetic desire. All human relations are governed by mimetic or imitative desire, or many or almost all human relations. We should not make it too absolute. How can we observe that? How can we prove it? I mean, the most strongest proof we find in fashion, the whole world of fashion. We see it now in the last couple of years in the attraction of social media. Social media are very much mimetically driven. And it is a fact that we human beings always and very often compare with each other. So we cannot really avoid comparing with others. So that's part of life sometimes, or very often not the nicest part, but there is no way to run away of these relational relations that we all have and are very much governed by mimetic or imitative desire. What was one of my most important findings was that 2 very old philosophers and theologians, Plato and Augustine, very early on understood that we human beings imitate what we adore. And so imitation and adoration has to go together. We do not imitate just somebody out of the blue or because there is nobody else there, but we imitate what we adore, what we find is cool, what we find as a real role model, what we look up at, to whom we look up. That is very difficult to not imitate. So therefore, for Plato and Augustine, it was also very decisive, whom do we adore? What is at the center of our adoration? Because that will ultimately guide our imitation. We also know about mirror neurons. I mean, Girard did not know about mirror neurons when he discovered mimetic desire by reading European novels from Cervantes to Proust and Dostoevsky. But when mirror neurons were discovered, one could immediately see that there is even a hardware in our bodies that is part and parcel of our mimetic behaving. So a first thing I always underline, because very often Girard is too too much seen as just a theory of conflict, or even attributed to represent an ontology of violence, or is represented in a very negative, pessimistic way. And I think this is a misreading. It's not a good reading of Girard's mimetic theory. In one of his books, in the book I See Satan Fall Like Lightning, he has two sentences, and both have to be understood in their relation and connection. The first sentence is that social science often overlooks the conflictual nature of human relations, and that is true. But in the same book, we have also the sentence, mimetic desire is intrinsically good. And this is very often, at least by some readers of Girard, overlooked. Mimetic desire is intrinsically good. So the basis is good, but then the question is, what are the preconditions that turn mimetic desire into mimetic rivalries and violence? And I always emphasize there are two important preconditions that help us to look a little bit closer into the complexity of mimetic desire. The first precondition is the negative development depends on the quality and the essence of our goal of desire. Can this goal be shared, or is it divisive? The Christian tradition distinguished between temporal and eternal goods. And that's a very important distinction. In the discussion, I can go a little bit deeper, but I'm currently working on Mahatma Gandhi and Indian tradition, also a little bit on Islam. So this is not only in the Christian tradition, the center of all the world religions addresses in some way this question of the essence of our goals of desire, of what is the highest good and what are lesser important goods. So it depends very much on the goods, on the goals of our desire. Are these goods competitive, or are they cooperative? So this is a very important thing. The second thing is also important, and the second thing leads then immediately to sibling rivalry, and that's the distance between subject and model. So the closer they get to each other, the more likely it is that their relation becomes rivalrous. So this is a paradoxical insight, but it's an insight that has to be taken very seriously, because it shows that the more we create equality and egalitarian relations, which is a good thing from my point of view, the more we have to face rivalries and tensions and conflicts. And not to realize that would be a misunderstanding of main problems in our world and in our relations. So there was a, I would like to recommend also today 2 or 3 books that have taken up Girard in a very profound way. And one of the best books I read a couple of years ago was the book of the former chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, who died about a year ago or something like that. And he wrote a book on religious violence with the title, Not in God's Name. And in this book, he talks about religious violence, relationship between Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, and makes the interesting observation by doing in that book nothing but a careful reading of the first book of the Hebrew Bible, the book of Genesis. And he says one of the interesting remarks, and the whole book is based anthropologically on Sigmund Freud's observation about the narcissism of small difference, and based on René Girard's insights into mimetic desire and mimetic rivalries. So one of the quotes that you find in this book, if you look at the 11 times the word love, ahava, in the book is mentioned in the book of Genesis, we make an extraordinary discovery. Every time love is mentioned, it generates conflict. Isaac loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Jacob loved Joseph, Rachel's firstborn, more than his other son. From this came 2 of the most faithful sibling rivalries in Jewish history. In a general sense, Rabbi Sachs makes the observation that it's probably sibling rivalry that is at the root of many and the most difficult human conflicts. And in the book of Genesis is full of it. Think about Cain, Abel, Isaac, Ishmael, Sarah, Hagar, Jacob, Esau, and Joseph and his brother. The good thing about the book is also, I cannot now go really deeply into that, that he also shows that in some way the book of Genesis shows us also ways out of these conflicts that are still relevant for our world of today. And Girard made the same observation in his book, Violence and the Sacred. He writes, "We instinctively tend to regard the fraternal relationship as an affectionate one, yet the mythological, historical, and literary examples that spring to mind tell a different story. Cain and Abel, Jacob and Esau, Eteocles and Polynices, Romulus and Remus, Richard the Lion-Hearted, and John Lackland." And one could continue and go on. So we have to focus a little bit on this sibling rivalry. And I spent the first half of last year in South Africa for 5 months, working on Mahatma Gandhi from a Girardian perspective, because Gandhi lived 21 years in South Africa, and it was very fruitful to do this study. And I saw also that anthropologically you find a lot of similarities between Girard and Gandhi. And one of the similarities we find in regard to sibling rivalry versus, or rivalry, mimetic rivalry versus a conflict of civilizations. You see in the picture the two rivals in South Africa, the two adversaries, General Smuts, who was a military man, but also a leading politician in South Africa, and Mahatma Gandhi, who was supporting the Indian minority over against the Europeans who discriminated against the Indians, but also, of course, about the African people there. And there was a debate in the early years of the 20th century between General Smuts and Mahatma Gandhi that is very close to our discussion of 9/11. We can see 9/11 as a clash of civilizations, as Samuel Huntington has done, or we can see it as a result of planetary competition, as René Girard has done. And a similar debate happened between Jan Smuts and Mohandas Gandhi at the beginning of the 20th century, even with the same words. I was struck by that. So I just have to put away your pictures in order to be able to read my own presentation. The debate was that General Smuts said, well, the Indian civilization and the Indian culture and the European culture are so different that there is never a really living together possible. And some of the Europeans wanted the Indians to go back to India. And Gandhi said, no, it's not a conflict of two civilizations. It's nothing but trade jealousy. So the discrimination of Indians in Natal and Transvaal in South Africa at that time was not a conflict between cultures. The origin, Gandhi wrote, of the whole matter is trade jealousy. It is perfectly apparent to all who are not blinded by color prejudice. And he also used a famous picture that is already from ancient Greek tradition. There are references in the Bible and in literature throughout the centuries. That's the dog in the manger. Because the dog in the manger is angry against the horse and the bull and the cow who want to get their hay in the manger, although the dog himself is not interested in it good at all. So there's a rivalry, envious rivalry, and Gandhi described the relation of the Europeans to the Indians as the dog in the manger, because the Europeans did not want to produce a lot of agricultural products and do agricultural work in Natal, which is a very fruitful landscape and very good for agriculture. The Indians did, but the Europeans said, no, the Indians should not have the benefit of this world there. In 1925, this is also very close to Girardian insights. In 1925, an American bishop of the Methodist Church, who was at that time in India, made a couple of weeks a tour through South Africa to look at the fate of the Indian people there. And he also described the relation as a relationship of jealousy, competition. And in a little book on Gandhi in 1925, no, not in the 30s, he wrote the following: "What happens when a brown man can afford a Rolls Royce? Is that not a direct insult to those white people who still have to run Fords? There is something wrong somewhere," argued the whites. "We must look into this matter." They did, to such purpose that the legislative adoption of a series of anti-Asiatic acts aggravated the disparity between the whites and the browns. Here was social, legal, and commercial discrimination. So that's was my first point. The second point is about the contagious nature of violence. So especially violence is so contagious and imitative that as soon as violence gets into the picture, it easily and quickly can escalate, can lead to a spiral of violence. Violence is contagious like the plague, and that we can, and I think you discussed it already, that we can especially get from Girard's last book, where he reads carefully Karl von Clausewitz's war theory, this German war thinker from the Napoleonic era. Clausewitz understood very well that violence tends to an escalation to extremes, and Girard highlights that very much. And I mean, in 2007, when this book came out in France for the first time, many people were a little bit shocked and said, this is a little full of doom and despair and negative and apocalyptic. And it's true in some way. But if you look to some events that happened between 2007 and our world of today, the book was very often proven right by the things that happened in between. Just today, I just was watching for a couple of minutes the news, and when they talk, for instance, today about Ukraine and Russia, they talk about the danger of an escalation of conflict. Again, there is a very interesting parallel to Gandhi, because also Gandhi, like Girard, like Clausewitz, they all understood the escalating nature of violence, and that was one of the reasons why Gandhi became so much in favor of the Sermon on the Mount. So one of the quotes you can find in Gandhi on the contagious nature of violence is the following: "Once the evil spirit of violence is unleashed, by its inherent nature, it cannot be checked or even kept within any prescribed limits. All violence inevitably tends to run to excess." I mean, this sentence could be written by Girard, it could be written by Clausewitz, but it was written by Gandhi. And it was for this reason that Gandhi, in the following of the Sermon on the Mount, but also his own Indian religious traditions, that he said we have to find a way out of this problem. "It has been my invariable experience that good evokes good, evil, evil, and that therefore if the evil does not receive the corresponding response, it ceases to act, dies of want of nutrition. Evil can only live upon itself. Sages of old, knowing this law, instead of returning evil for evil, deliberately returned good for evil and killed it." Especially when Gandhi here talks about that evil needs to receive the corresponding response, is a very deep insight into the contagious nature of violence and is the danger of an escalation to extremes. Well, you might say now, Palaver, because he did research on Gandhi, talks about Gandhi, but this is decades ago. What does that? What does it mean for our world of today? Well, that's another book I would like to recommend, and many of you probably have heard or even read it. It's the Indian English writer and essayist Pankaj Mishra, and his book Age of Anger, that in some way wants to describe and understand the rise of right-wing populism, the rise of Trump or Erdogan or Putin or other developments all over the world, in Brazil, in India, in Europe, in the United States. And this book is full of insights and references to mimetic theory and Girard. I just bring one quote to your attention, and the quote is the following: "The key to mimic man's behavior lies not in any clash of opposed civilizations, but on the contrary, in irresistible mimetic desire. The logic of fascination, emulation, and righteous self-assertion that binds the rivals inseparably. It lies in resentment, the tormented mirror games in which the West, as well as its ostensible enemies and indeed all inhabitants of the modern world, are trapped." In 2018, we had a conference of Girardian scholars, the Colloquium on Violence and Religion in Madrid, and we were able to invite Pankaj Mishra for a question and answer session. We filmed this session, and you can watch it on YouTube, and it's a quite interesting talk where we talked about religion, resentment, why he thinks that Girard is a very important thinker for our time, and so on. So that's worth to go a little bit deeper. He is and was influenced by mimetic theory, by literature, and has a lot to say about those issues. So I just continue one more slide to my second point, because Gandhi's active nonviolence, which is complementing in some way Girard's theory. Girard remains more an analytic anthropologist who tries to understand what's going on, but he doesn't give recipes, or he doesn't show us ways out of violence. He is not an ethicist. He doesn't do peace ethics. So in my sense, Gandhi's concept of nonviolence, Satyagraha, meaning truth force or love force, active nonviolence, or even militant nonviolence, is a way out of violence that is very much aligned with Girard, but going more in the positive direction. Gandhi, of course, said nonviolence is not a passive, not resistance to evil and injustice, but a form of resistance that does not mirror the opponent, does not mirror the violent oppression. It is not complacent, it is not indifferent, but it doesn't go into the same directions, but it's a third way, as the biblical scholar Walter Wink wrote in a very important book that he wrote and discussed with people during the apartheid times in South Africa in the 80s. Gandhi wrote, "My creed of nonviolence is an extremely active force. It has no room for cowardice or even weakness. There is hope for a violent man to be someday nonviolent, but there is none for a coward." And in this, he understood also the Sermon on the Mount. He also understood Jesus in that way when he says there is no passivity in Jesus. Jesus is a satyagrahi in his sense. And Gandhi's understanding of the Sermon on the Mount, Gandhi's understanding of Jesus influenced modern day biblical scholars, Christian scholars tremendously. Walter Wink in 1987 then translates Matthew 5:39 not as "do not resist evil," which could be complacency, which could be indifference, which could be neutrality or not concern about injustice at all. The proper translation would be, do not violently resist evil, because it would lead to an escalation. It would lead into this spiral of violence. So a short third point, that's overcoming the scapegoat mechanism by siding with the victim. And now I'm going more into Girard's understanding of different religious traditions. Early on, Girard distinguished between the religion that comes from man. He calls it the sacred. It's the early religion that is the result of the scapegoat mechanism, and the religion that comes from God. And he makes the interesting observation that again contributes to his insights about modern dangers, that by uncovering the scapegoat mechanism, the biblical revelation deprives us of the sacred as a protection against our own violence, but also makes us aware of the victims of persecution. Girard often claims that it's also sometimes overlooked, that the modern world is the worst and the best of all worlds at the same time. So Girard is not someone who sees modernity as something completely negative or completely positive. He sees both sides. So this losing the protection of the old sacred easily can lead to nuclear apocalypse if we cannot avoid the escalation to extremes. But it also inspired and inspires the legacy of the human rights, the concern for the victims of violence, and we became more sensitive, more aware of all the different forms of violence that are going on in our world. Defending victims is good, but can turn into a dangerous weapon. That's also one of the key insights of Girard that is very important to let us understand global terrorism of today, also populist movements, because in some way this Abrahamic revolution, as I sometimes call it, that we no longer are religious in the sense of the sacred by uniting against the victim, but the world religions, the Abrahamic religions, are religions who side with the victims of persecution. And that's a good thing, but it can turn into a very dangerous weapon if we think because we side with victims, we are now legitimated to persecute violently those who persecute the victims, because that's again a very dangerous escalation. And I studied for a couple of years terrorism, and I can tell you there is no terrorist group, whatever background culturally, religiously they have, who are not immediately claiming the victims they are siding with, the victims they are defending and legitimating therefore their violent acts. And there is one little thing where I differ slightly from Girard, because Girard said sometimes the Nazis wanted to go back to the old sacred, to pagan religion, whereas communism is the danger of outpoping, so to say, Christianity, or being even more Christian than the Christians by fully siding with the victim in a violent way. But a colleague of mine a couple of years ago showed me a very interesting review of Hitler's Mein Kampf by George Orwell. And George Orwell observes correctly that Hitler presented himself to his own people in Germany as a victim, and the German nation as a victim nation. And that was the legitimation of his type of violence, his starting of wars, his type of warmongering. So that means this siding with the victim conquered the world, that all over the world you see a competition for the status of victim in order to defend your rights or increase your rights and so on. So this is one of the dangers that we have, danger coming out of something very good. And I already am closing my introductory remarks by going to my fourth observation. That means and underlines that we have to distinguish between the sacred and the holy. And that's a very important thing if we want to contribute something substantial and something that makes sense in regard to religion. Because very often religion is seen as a singular concept, and to define religion, to understand religion is very difficult. I would say if we would start a discussion and try to define the definition of religion that would satisfy all of us, I don't think 2 hours would be enough to achieve that, because it's such a complex thing. So many different things are happening under the label of religion. But I think we have to distinguish at least 2 different forms. And I start with the famous French sociologist Émile Durkheim. He made an important observation because he identified religion with society. So what society in general makes the people do is what religion, so to say, in a broad understanding, wants them to do. Then when we want to explain violence, very often today, religion is seen as a main source of violence. But then we have also the observation that religion can be a provider of peace. And then out of these different observations, we come up with theses like there is a general ambivalence of the sacred, like the US scholar Scott Appleby claims also in his understanding of violence, terrorism, and so on. But I think this is not very helpful, because if religion is in general just ambivalent, we cannot say anything. This is too close to a German thinker who influenced our understanding of religion also in this way, and not in a good way, because Rudolf Otto saw religion as in identity with irrationality and non-rationality. And well, that closes, so to say, a proper understanding. So for this reason, I prefer the French philosopher Henri Bergson, who is in some way a predecessor, a forerunner of Girard, because Bergson, of course, was also sure that Durkheim made an important observation. But he wrote a rebuttal of Durkheim by insisting that there are 2 types of religion. So the book, the late book of Bergson, The 2 Sources of Morality and Religion of 1932, is very important, because it's in you do not get it immediately, and you have to read it very careful, that you see that it is a rebuttal of Durkheim. But if you read it carefully and know Durkheim and Bergson, you see it's really Durkheim identifies society, the social, with religion. And Bergson said, yes, that's true, but this is only one type of religion. We have to distinguish 2. And so we can observe that there is an important link, important continuity between Bergson and Girard. Bergson described the first type of religion, that was the first form that characterizes the early religions of hunter-gatherers and the first hierarchical societies, as static religion. That is the ideological religious foundation of what we call a closed society. And it's very much what Girard described with the term sacred. But then Bergson also observed a very different type of religion that is close to the Jewish prophets, to Christianity, to mysticism, but goes also into other religious traditions. It's not so much a religion of the collective, of the tribe, but individual experience that he calls dynamic religion. And dynamic religion is the basis of what we call open society, of human family, of global solidarity, and is very close to the term holy that Girard used for this understanding of religion. And it's only in the last book of Girard, in his book on Clausewitz, Battling to the End, or in English, or Achever Clausewitz in French, where he really makes this careful distinction between the sacred and the holy. In earlier works, you have to look very carefully to see it. But I think it's also very important, and that's my last remark for the time being, that his first book on religion, La violence et le sacré in French, or The Violence and the Sacred, has two very important, the title has already two important insights. First of all, it's not religion and violence, because that's the way most of the time we discuss this matter, but it's violence and religion, because human violence is the source of this type of religion. Secondly, Girard doesn't talk about religion. He talks about violence et le sacré. He talks about violence and the sacred. That's his understanding of early religion, the static religion, the closed societies. And only later then he showed how the biblical religions and the world religions are a different type that are better characterized with the term holy.